Story 1. The Ghost of Echo Street. In the sultry, mosquito-laden nights of a Louisiana Air Force base, where the air hung heavy with humidity and secrets, a tale persisted among the airmen, a story whispered in the dim glow of patrol truck dashboards and recounted with hushed reverence. The base, sprawling across acres of pine forests and marshy lowlands, was a place where the modern machinery of war coexisted uneasily with older, darker forces. Among the many ghost stories that circulated, none was as chilling as the legend of the little girl of Echo Street, a spectral presence tied to a tragedy that had seeped into the very soil of the storage facility. Airman First Class Daniel Harper arrived at the base in the summer of 2006, a fresh-faced recruit eager to prove himself. Like all newcomers, he was regaled with tales of the supernatural, a man in a top hat who stalked a lonely dirt road, his silhouette flickering under the moonlight, a deranged figure struck by a patrol car, only to vanish into the woods. But it was the story of the little girl that lodged itself in Daniel's mind, told to him on his second night by Senior Airman Marcus Tate, a grizzled veteran with a penchant for storytelling. She was the daughter of a construction worker, Marcus began, his voice low as their patrol truck idled near the storage area's rusted gates. Back in the 80s, when they were building this place, she'd come to visit her dad. Loved climbing the scaffolds, they said. One day she slipped, fell from the top of that structure right there. He pointed to a looming, skeletal frame of steel and concrete, its silhouette stark against the starry sky. They say her scream still echoes down Echo Street, and if you're here late enough, you might hear her. Daniel laughed it off, chalking it up to hazing, but Marcus's eyes held no humor. That night, Marcus drove him to the exact spot, killed the engine, and turned off the radio. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Marcus startled Daniel with a sudden shout, but nothing spectral appeared. Still, the seed of unease was planted. 3 years later, in 2009, Daniel was no longer the green recruit. He'd grown accustomed to the base's rhythms, its long shifts, and its ghost stories, which he'd dismissed as folklore. But on a muggy August night, he was assigned to patrol the now-abandoned storage facility with his partner, Airman First Class Kayla Ruiz, a no-nonsense Texan with a quick wit. The facility, once bustling with activity, had been decommissioned, its warehouses left to decay. Only a few areas required routine checks, accessible through two massive gates that groaned with rust. Their patrol vehicle that night was a relic, a battered cattle truck, its diesel engine rattling like a death knell. "This thing's a disgrace," Kayla muttered as they bounced along the uneven roads. Daniel, riding shotgun, scanned the darkness with a flashlight, his mind wandering to the stories he'd heard years ago. The night was uneventful until their final check at 4 a.m., when they approached Echo Street. The air grew heavier as they turned onto the narrow road, the truck's headlights cutting through a thickening fog. The chatter between Daniel and Kayla faded, replaced by an inexplicable tension. Daniel felt it first, a prickling at the back of his neck, a sense that something was watching. The truck's rumble seemed to dull, the radio's faint country tune fading into a hiss of static. Halfway down Echo Street, near the infamous structure, the world went silent. Then it came, a sound that froze Daniel's blood. A low, guttural moan, like a wounded animal or a soul in torment, emanated from nowhere and everywhere. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, curling through the cab like a living thing. Daniel's heart pounded as he turned to Kayla, expecting her to be playing a prank. "Cut it out," he snapped, but her face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. The moan came again, louder, more distinct, a chilling, feminine groan that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Daniel fumbled for the radio, switching it off, and the silence that followed was worse. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Kayla nodded, her breath shallow. They sat frozen, the truck idling as the sound returned, now accompanied by a faint scratching, as if something were clawing at the truck's undercarriage. The moan grew into a wail, a sound so raw and anguished it seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. Daniel's flashlight beam darted outside, catching nothing but shadows and fog. Kayla's hand gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling. But before she could shift gears, the wail intensified, splitting into multiple voices, some high and childlike, others deep and guttural. The truck shook as if struck by an unseen force. Daniel screamed, dropping his flashlight, and Kayla slammed the accelerator. The cattle truck lurched forward, tires screeching as they tore down Echo Street, the wails pursuing them like a chorus of the damned. They didn't stop until they reached the gates. Daniel leapt out, fumbling with the locks, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the keys. Kayla kept the engine running, her eyes scanning the darkness. As Daniel secured the second gate, he swore he saw a figure, a small, pale shape, standing at the edge of Echo Street, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. He didn't look back as he dove into the truck, and Kayla sped them to safety. Back at the main base, they reported to their flight chief, Master Sergeant Ronald Hayes, expecting skepticism. Instead, Hayes's face grew grim. "I believe you," he said, his voice heavy. "I heard something like that myself years ago, on that same road, and again in the old jailhouse." He gestured to a squat, windowless building nearby. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Daniel never returned to Echo Street after that night. He requested transfers to other patrol routes, avoiding the storage facility entirely. The experience left him changed, haunted by the memory of that wail and the fleeting glimpse of that figure. Years later, as a civilian, he still woke from nightmares, hearing the moan of the little girl who never left Echo Street. Story 2. The Jungle's Secret. The Vietnam War was a crucible of chaos, a place where young men were forged into soldiers or broken by the relentless jungle. For Private First Class Thomas Callahan, a lanky 19-year-old from Ohio, it was a descent into a world he could barely comprehend. Drafted straight out of high school in 1968, Thomas arrived in Vietnam with a radio operator's kit strapped to his back, a clunky relic of technology that weighed as much as his fears. His duty was simple: keep the lines of communication open, ensuring his unit stayed connected in the dense, unforgiving jungle. But what he encountered went far beyond the battlefield, into a realm of horror that would scar him for life. Thomas's first weeks were a blur of humidity, gunfire, and the stench of rotting vegetation. Stationed with a tight-knit platoon in the Mekong Delta, he learned to navigate the chaos of ambushes and the eerie silence of night patrols. His unit, led by the stoic Lieutenant James Carver, had just lost their previous radio operator to a landmine, and Thomas felt the weight of their expectations. His first firefight was a cacophony of screams and explosions, the jungle erupting in a hail of bullets. When it ended, Thomas stood over the bodies of 3 Viet Cong soldiers, their lifeless eyes staring into the canopy. The sight shook him, but he buried his revulsion, telling himself they were the enemy. As months passed, Thomas grew hardened to the violence, but the jungle never felt safe. The air was thick with the buzz of insects and the whispers of unseen threats. Stories circulated among the men, tales of ghostly figures in the mist, of voices calling from the trees. Thomas dismissed them as stress-induced fantasies, but the jungle had a way of making even the skeptical question their sanity. One sweltering afternoon, Thomas was summoned by his non-commissioned officer to meet a man who stood out like a specter among the grime-covered soldiers. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a crisp uniform and a demeanor that commanded silence. "Intelligence Officer Frederick Douglass," he introduced himself, his voice smooth but cold. Thomas's commanding officer, usually a towering presence, seemed diminished in Douglass's shadow, nodding deferentially. Douglass explained that Thomas was being reassigned as a radio operator for his special unit, effective immediately. Despite his loyalty to his platoon, Thomas had no choice but to comply. A Huey helicopter whisked them to a remote outpost, a cluster of Viet Cong huts nestled in a heavily forested valley. The area reeked of decay and gunpowder, the ground scarred from recent fighting. Thomas noticed the soldiers there were different, silent, emotionless, their eyes vacant yet piercing. Some wore gas masks, their breathing a rhythmic hiss. When Thomas tried to engage them, they offered only blank stares, as if their humanity had been stripped away. The atmosphere was suffocating, a sense of wrongness permeating the air. Douglas led Thomas to a small hut and ordered him to stay put. "Someone will fetch you," he said, his tone leaving no room for questions. But Thomas's curiosity gnawed at him. The strange soldiers, the oppressive silence. It was too much. After an hour, he crept toward the main tent, its canvas flaps swaying in the breeze. Peering inside, he saw a sight that would haunt him for decades. On a crude table sat 6 glass containers, each filled with a sickly green liquid. Inside were the severed heads of Viet Cong soldiers, their faces frozen in grotesque expressions. Tubes and wires protruded from their skulls, and the liquid bubbled as if alive. Worst of all, their eyes twitched, their mouths quivered, as if some perverse science had trapped them in a state between life and death. Thomas's stomach churned, bile rising in his throat. He stumbled back, only to feel an iron grip on his shoulder. Douglas's face was a mask of fury. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, dragging Thomas back to the hut. Thomas stammered a question about the heads, but Douglas's glare silenced him. "Forget what you saw," he said, his voice a low threat. "For your own sake." That night, the outpost came under attack, or so Thomas was told. He awoke in a triage unit, his body a map of pain. Broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, and a concussion that left his memories fragmented. He had no recollection of the attack, only a vague sense of screams and the stench of chemicals. Douglas and his unit were gone, as if they'd never existed. When Thomas asked about them, his inquiries were met with blank stares or curt dismissals. Years later, as a graying veteran, Thomas still wrestled with what he'd seen. Were they experimenting on the enemy, trying to extract secrets from the dead? Or was it something darker, something that defied reason? The twitching heads, the emotionless soldiers, they were pieces of a puzzle he could never solve. He told his story only to his wife and a trusted friend, fearing that speaking it aloud would summon the horrors back into his life. The jungle had taken much from him, but it was the secret of that outpost that left the deepest scar. Story 3. The Numbers of Zone Bravo. In the desolate expanse of a classified military base, where the fog clung to the earth like a shroud, Sergeant Michael Reyes led Alpha Unit into the unknown. It was 2015, and their mission was to investigate the sudden reemergence of Bravo Unit, a team that had vanished weeks earlier without a trace. The base, once a hub of covert operations, was now a ghost town, its buildings crumbling under the weight of neglect. The distress call that had sparked this mission was no ordinary signal. It was a looping sequence of numbers, 58247, broadcast in a monotone voice that chilled the blood. Michael, a seasoned soldier with a knack for keeping his squad grounded, felt the weight of the mission from the start. His team, Corporal Sarah Lee, a sharp-witted communications specialist, and Private First Class Ethan Carter, a rookie with a nervous edge, disembarked from their armored vehicle into a fog so thick it seemed to swallow sound. The base was eerily silent, the only noise the crunch of their boots on shattered glass and the distant hum of the numbers broadcast. As they moved through the abandoned streets, signs of violence were everywhere. Overturned furniture, blood-stained rags, bullet casings scattered like confetti. The command center, their first objective, was a tomb of blinking consoles and stale air. The radio crackled with the numbers, relentless and unchanging. 58247, 58247. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to trace the signal, her usual confidence shaken. "What does it mean?" she whispered, her eyes scanning the shadows. Michael had no answers, but he knew they had to find Commander Haskins, Bravo Unit's leader. They pressed deeper into the base, the fog growing denser, the silence more oppressive. The laboratory was their next stop, its door hanging off its hinges like a broken jaw. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay and chemicals. Shattered vials crunched underfoot, and papers fluttered in the stale breeze. Then they saw them, Bravo Unit, or what remained of them. The bodies were sprawled across the floor, their faces twisted in agony. No bullet wounds, no signs of a fight, just terror etched into their lifeless features. Sarah stifled a gasp, and Ethan's face went pale. In a corner, they found Commander Haskins, His body rigid, a notepad clutched in his hand. Scrawled across it were the numbers, 58247, followed by a single sentence. "They're coming for us." The words hit Michael like a punch. Who were they? The enemy? Something else? The numbers looped on, a maddening chant that seemed to pulse in the walls. Panic clawed at the edges of their training, but Michael forced his voice to stay steady. "We need to move," he said, though his guts screamed to run. As they retraced their steps, the fog seemed to thicken, the base closing in like a trap. The numbers grew louder, no longer confined to the radio but echoing in the air, as if the fog itself were speaking. Then from the mist, a figure emerged, a tall, cloaked shape, its movements unnatural, its face obscured. Michael's heart raced as the figure glided closer, its presence radiating a cold that pierced his bones. "Move now!" he shouted, snapping his team into action. They sprinted for the vehicle, the figure's shadow looming in the fog. Sarah fumbled with the radio, her voice cracking as she called for extraction. "This is Alpha Unit. Mayday! Mayday! We need immediate evac from Zone Bravo." The numbers drowned her out, a relentless tide of sound. They reached the vehicle, piling in as Michael gunned the engine. The figure vanished into the fog, but its presence lingered, a weight on their souls. As they sped away, the base faded into the mist, the numbers fading but never stopping. Michael's mind raced with questions. What had happened to Bravo Unit? What did the numbers mean? And who or what had they seen? Back at headquarters, they reported to their commanding officer, expecting disbelief. Instead, Colonel Amanda Pierce's face hardened. "You're not the first to encounter this," she said, her voice low. "Zone Bravo has a history. Things happen there that don't make it into reports." She offered no further explanation, only a warning to keep silent. Michael and his team were reassigned, but the mystery of Zone Bravo followed them. Sarah became obsessed, poring over old records for clues about the numbers. Ethan struggled with nightmares, waking in a cold sweat to the sound of 58247. Michael, haunted by the cloaked figure, felt a growing resolve. They owed it to Bravo Unit to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying. Years later, as civilians, they met in secret, piecing together fragments of information. The numbers they discovered matched coordinates to a classified project buried in the base's past, a project tied to experiments that defied nature. The cloaked figure remained a specter, its identity unknown. The horrors of Zone Bravo were a chapter in a larger, darker story, one that Michael knew would haunt them until they found answers, or until the fog claimed them too.